Out of the three things: layers, selection tools, and layer masks. Okay, so I made this animation to kind of explain the concept of layers to you. So imagine that you have some photo. Imagine this is just a flat photo that you're putting into Photoshop, right? Like, just like it would be the Mona Lisa. Like, there's nothing done with it, right? So what you're doing is, imagine the layer structure is that you're putting the layer down, and I've kind of moved it so that the layers are now horizontally stacked on top of each other. The bottom layer being the picture, and that's what it's going to show on the screen, okay? So then you put another layer on, right? So say you want to paint a layer onto this thing. What you would do in Photoshop is, instead of, like, did anybody ever use Microsoft, like old Microsoft Paint, where you used to kind of paint or do something like old, old PC kind of basic painting, is you would just paint everything onto the same screen and you would never be able to separate anything. But in Photoshop, what we would do, as opposed to actually painting directly on that bottom layer, is we would paint on a separate layer. Because then that way we could go back later and change that paint layer in whatever way we could, and we would never actually be changing any of the original photo. The original photo would be completely maintained in its original form, which is the best because it allows you the most flexibility for how you want to edit things along the way. So if we were to paint on a separate layer, we're calling it a paint layer in this case, but they're all just called paint. See, you would come out like this. You'd have two different layers, one with that black squiggly paint, and the other one is the original photo, but it looks like this. It looks like it's one photo in Photoshop, and the end photo looks like that. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Okay. So what you could then do is, there's all these things where you can keep layering things on top. Do as many layers as you want. I've done compositions that are quite simple, that are 80 to 100 layers when you get into complex things, because you want to keep everything separate so that you can change everything and have that ultimate control over how everything looks. So say we wanted to put a solid layer of mauve in this case, right? What do you think that would look like? You put that on top, and that would look like mauve, right? Because the topmost layer is a solid layer. Even though you have an original photo and you have this paint layer, but this layer right here is solid. So because of that, all you see, and because it's the top layer, all that you see is the solid layer on top, right? So this is what your screen looks like, but you have all this information below it, okay? So that's why it's really important, the order that you put those layers in terms of what's going to be important. Okay, so what are we going to do next? We are going to do what's called changing the opacity. It's also, it's referred to as a lot of different things, but it's a really important thing in Adobe in general, is being able to make it slightly transparent, right? So we're going to move that down from 100% opacity, which means it's totally solid in color, to 50% opacity, which means that 50% of the pixels are getting through. So now you layer that on top, and see, now you can see how instead of having that solid 100% opaque layer on top, we can see what's underneath, right? Because we can see how this layer is shading the rest of the layer with its 50% opacity, and then it's also, we can see everything that's going underneath. Does that make sense in terms of you can see how layers are working? What we're going to do now is we're actually going to open Photoshop, because that's why we're all here, right? Down here, the layers panel. This down here in this corner, this bottom right-hand corner, is where it always is, and most people always keep it there. That is where that layers panel is. So when I was talking about all those different layers that you have, the bottommost layer shows up as the bottom on this screen here, and then everything else gets stacked on top of it. And so that layers panel is incredibly important to know.
Okay, so here you can see the layers panel. The topmost, if I were to untoggle the eye on all of these, then you would be able to see how each of them is affecting the overall composition of our Photoshop document. By untoggling the eye, you can see how each of the stacking order of everything is very carefully determined, which is why if I were to put the background up here, then suddenly you wouldn't be able to see anything because it would be that topmost layer. There are a lot of filter tools in this right here, as well as different blend modes. Blend modes are ways of determining how everything interacts with everything. So right now I am changing this topmost layer that is called the oil painting layer, and I am changing how it's interacting. You can see how, because that layer is affecting the entire thing, even though it's only 19% opacity, it affects everything by the way that I change the blend mode. Now I'm going to change the background, and you can see how those can have a very, very profound effect on the outcome of how everything interacts with one another. The pixels are interacting with each other. What aspects of luminosity and color are allowed to show up. Down here, you have adjustment layers. Adjustment layers are very important, again, where you put their order in the layers panel. So effectively, if you put an adjustment layer and you either clip it to a single layer, it'll only affect that layer, or if you put it on top, it will affect everything below it, which is why the layer order, or stacking order, is again so important. Up here, we have more filters that we were showing before. And this is another filter menu. This is the opacity slider. When I was talking about that layer only having 17% opacity, this is what I'm talking about. 100% means it's completely opaque. Anything less than that is a percentage of the pixels being able to allow light to shine through behind them, or the layer below them. Right here, we have different choices that we can do in terms of choosing what we want to do to layers. So for instance, this is a lock. You can see this layer is locked. Nothing can happen to this layer. So that is your overview of what a layer is in Photoshop. Hopefully the alternative explanation can help you understand just exactly how important they are to Photoshop, as well as how they can help you do your work.